The room was packed, cameras flashing, journalists scribbling as Kristi Noem stood confidently at the podium. She wore her signature blazer and defiant smile, proud of her latest speech to the Global Values Summit in Atlanta. And just like she'd done in countless interviews back home, she leaned into the moment with one sentence designed to silence the room. Sometimes, to lead, you have to tame beasts. There was a pause, then a few scattered claps. She smirked. You've all seen the headlines. Yes, I put down a dog that didn't listen. Yes, I made decisions that some of you found uncomfortable. But I'd rather be feared than ignored. A ripple of discomfort moved through the crowd. But she mistook it for admiration. Across the stage, Ibrahim Traoré sat still, his hands folded, his expression unreadable. He had been invited as a counter-voice, but Noem clearly didn't think much of that role. So, she added, glancing his way, if leadership makes you squeamish, maybe you don't belong at the table. That was it. The jab. The challenge. The invitation. Traoré rose slowly. He didn't look angry. He looked focused. Grounded. He walked toward the mic, not rushing, not smiling, and stood there in silence for a moment. The room leaned in. Then he spoke, calm but clear. You say you tame beasts, he said, his accent steady, but tell me, do you call that leadership? No one moved. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't gesture. He just let the question land. You killed because it was easier than understanding. You silenced because you feared being questioned. That's not strength. That's insecurity with a badge. Kristi shifted in place. He continued. Where I come from, leadership means protecting the weak, not eliminating them. It means lifting voices, not choking them when they bark too loudly. He looked her in the eye. And if that makes you uncomfortable, maybe you don't belong at the table. Kristi Noem's jaw tightened, but her lips curled in a smile, forced, tight, brittle. She wasn't used to being challenged. Not like this. Not by someone who didn't shout back. Ibrahim, she said, stepping toward the mic with that sharp, familiar tone she used on debate stages, we don't live in a fairy tale. We live in the real world. And in the real world, leaders make hard choices. That's what separates us from the chaos. Traoré didn't respond immediately. He just looked at her, calm as steel. Then. What you call chaos, he said, some of us call survival. The tension doubled. You speak of hard choices, he continued. But hard choices are supposed to be for the good of others, not the comfort of the one making them. He turned slightly toward the audience, now fully in his rhythm. You ended a life to prove a point. And then you turned that point into applause. That's not policy, it's performance. And it's not strength. It's fear wearing pride like a costume. Kristi scoffed. It was a dangerous dog. I was protecting my family. You wouldn't understand that. He looked at her, unflinching. On my continent, he said, we protect our families too. But we don't parade our violence. We don't brag about control. We teach discipline, not destruction. The audience murmured. Something shifted. She tried to regain control. Let me ask you this, then, what would you do if your people were threatened? If something wild was hurting what you love? Traoré turned fully toward her now. You call what you don't understand wild. That's the problem. He let that settle. Then, gently. Not everything unfamiliar is a beast. But every unexamined action can become one. The air grew still. And Kristi, so often the one throwing the knockout punch, suddenly found herself reeling from a quiet reply. She had the podium. But now, he had the room. Kristi Noem adjusted her blazer and took a breath, masking her frustration with that familiar, polished smile. You know what I think, Ibrahim, she said, hands resting on the podium. I think you mistake kindness for leadership. That sounds nice in speeches, but real power isn't about being liked, it's about being in control. In South Dakota, we don't wait for problems to grow teeth. We handle them before they bite. There it was again, violence disguised as decisiveness. She glanced at the crowd, expecting approval. But they weren't nodding. They were watching Traoré. He stepped forward, slow and deliberate. No, he said softly. What you mistake for control is just fear behind a louder voice. She tilted her head. Excuse me? You say leadership is being in control, he replied. But I lead a country where control was used to chain us, starve us, silence us. We were told it was for our own good, by people who looked a lot like you. Kristi stiffened. You talk about power as if it's a virtue, he continued. But the most powerful people I've met never needed to prove it. They didn't flex it, they carried it. The crowd was dead quiet now. He pointed to the backdrop behind them, where a banner read, Global Value Summit, Defining Strength in the 21st Century. Strength, Traoré said, turning to the audience, is not how loud you bark. It's how well you listen before you act. He looked back at Kristi. And leadership? Leadership is when people follow you not out of fear, but because they see themselves in your footsteps. She folded her arms, trying to smirk. You sound like a poet. But poets don't win elections. Traoré stepped forward one last time. Poets don't win elections, he said. But they survive empires. And with that, the applause began. Not forced. Not polite. But real. Kristi Noem's tone sharpened. You know what your problem is, she snapped, stepping away from the podium. You talk like you've got it all figured out, but the world doesn't run on ideals. It runs on order. On law. On strength. And sometimes that means being the one who makes the hard call. She was pacing now, classic strategy. Assert movement, reclaim momentum. Traoré didn't move. He didn't need to. Order without justice is just a cage, he replied quietly. And strength without compassion is just another name for fear. Kristi laughed once, short and brittle. You don't get it, do you? We don't all have the luxury of talking in metaphors. I govern. I protect. I don't ask the wolves if they feel misunderstood. The audience waited for his reply like it was a verdict. Traoré took one slow step forward. I've lived among wolves, he said. Some wore uniforms. Some wore suits. And every one of them claimed they were protecting something, while taking everything. He turned to face the crowd, then back to her. You speak of making hard calls. So let me ask you, was it hard when you ended that life? Or was it easy, because it barked instead of bowed? Kristi opened her mouth, but found no line sharp enough. Traoré continued. We've been told for centuries that civilization means silencing what's wild. But maybe what you fear isn't the wild, it's the part of yourself that can't be controlled. He paused. That's why you call us beasts. Not because we're dangerous. But because we refuse to kneel. The room fell still again. The audience wasn't breathing, they were learning. And Kristi Noem, so used to commanding rooms, found herself shrinking inside one she no longer owned. Kristi tried to pivot, her voice regaining that governor's cadence, the one designed for crowds, not confrontation. You talk about kneeling in empires like we're still living in the 1800s, she said. But we've evolved. We build, we protect, we organize. That's civilization. That's what makes us different from chaos. She paused for effect. And frankly, if you don't see the difference between a functioning state and the wilderness, then maybe your idea of leadership is stuck in the past. Some polite claps followed. Kristi smiled. A brief flash of confidence. But Traoré waited until the last clap died. Then he stepped closer, his voice low, not loud, but impossible to ignore. "You think civilization is about concrete and laws?" he asked. "Let me tell you what it's cost us." He raised his hand slowly, counting with his fingers. Language. Land. Names. Dignity. Family. Faith. All sacrificed on the altar of your version of order. Now his eyes locked on hers. "You say you've evolved. But evolved into what? A world where killing a dog becomes a campaign slogan? Where cruelty is spun as courage?" Kristi's face tensed. He turned to the audience again. "Where I come from, we don't build by destroying what we fear. We build by understanding it. We lead by walking among the people, not towering over them." He looked back at her. "You didn't tame a beast. You silenced a mirror. Because deep down, what you couldn't control frightened you." A few gasps in the crowd. Someone whispered, "That hit." He didn't stop. "You call it wilderness. I call it wisdom. You call it chaos. I call it life. And if that makes me uncivilized, then maybe civilization needs a reckoning." No applause. Just stillness. Because he hadn't delivered a line. He had delivered a truth. And Kristi? She finally looked like she'd heard one. Kristi Noem, once the dominant voice in every room she entered, now looked smaller. Not because she'd been attacked, but because her armor wasn't built for truth. Still, she wasn't ready to yield. She straightened her spine and forced a half-smile. "You talk about mirrors, about history, but history doesn't feed people. It doesn't build roads. It doesn't keep borders secure." She stepped forward, hands gesturing to the crowd. "I don't apologize for being strong. I lead a state where people depend on quick decisions, not poetic lectures. You may inspire people, but inspiration doesn't govern." There it was again, control. Wrapped in pragmatism. Framed as superiority. Traoré didn't flinch. He let her finish. Then replied with measured calm. "You're right, history doesn't build roads. But it decides who gets to walk on them." The room inhaled. "You govern a state," he continued. "I govern a story that was never meant to be told. And yet, here I am, telling it anyway." He turned toward the crowd. "You say inspiration isn't enough. But inspiration is why revolutions begin. It's why chains break. It's why people remember who they are when systems try to erase them." Now he faced Kristi again. "You speak of borders. But the harshest borders we face aren't between nations. They're between those with power, and those denied the right to define it." He paused, then stepped closer. "You want to lead through fear? You want to be tough? That's your choice. But don't confuse obedience with respect." Kristi tried to interrupt, but he kept going, voice steady as stone. "I'd rather lead people who stand tall with me than kneel quietly beneath me." Another murmur from the crowd. Not applause, realization. Traoré stood still. "I don't need to tame beasts," he said. "I choose to awaken people." And that's when it became clear. She wasn't leading the room anymore. She was learning in it. Kristi Noem took a slow step back from the mic and exhaled like someone preparing for a final shot. "If I've learned anything," she said, loud and crisp, "it's that strong nations aren't built on feelings, they're built on discipline. On sacrifice. On people willing to do what others won't." She turned, scanning the crowd. "You may judge what I did with that dog. But where I come from, we don't run from hard truths. We teach them. We face them. That's the American way." Some applause. Not much, but enough to stiffen her posture again. People want safety, predictability, and yes, tough choices. That's what separates great nations from unstable ones. We lead so others don't have to suffer from chaos. She turned sharply toward Traoré. And if you think your ideals can replace accountability, then maybe that's why your continent still struggles to catch up. Gasps. The line had crossed a line. But Traoré didn't blink. He didn't even move. He just said, "What you call patriotism, some of us recognize as polished cruelty." The room dropped 10 degrees. You say your people don't run from hard truths. But your systems run from the truth of what they've done to others. He took a single, deliberate step forward. You praise discipline, but what you mean is obedience. You praise sacrifice, but only when someone else is bleeding. You talk of greatness, but always at someone else's expense. Now his voice sharpened. You say my continent is behind. But behind what? The bombs? The prisons? The factories that profit while people starve? Kristi's face hardened, but her silence said more than defiance ever could. You didn't just kill a dog, he said. You turned it into a story about strength, because somewhere deep inside, you needed to believe that domination is noble. He let the silence drag. But true strength, he finished, is when you don't need to be feared to be heard. The room? No longer divided. Now it was watching her, and listening to him. Kristi Noem leaned in toward the mic, slower this time. Her voice had lost its sharpness, not because she lacked conviction, but because the crowd no longer reflected it back. Let me ask you something, Ibrahim, she said. What would you do if your people were under threat? If a danger came into your home, into your country? Would you hesitate to act? It was the last refuge of strongmen, justify control with danger. Traoré tilted his head slightly, then spoke, not with defense, but with precision. When my people are under threat, I act. But I never confuse inconvenience with danger. He stepped away from his podium, his presence calm yet unmistakably dominant. There's a difference between a threat and a discomfort. A barking dog may disturb your peace, but it doesn't endanger your values. Kristi interjected. You didn't see what I saw. You didn't live it. Traoré nodded once. No, I lived worse. I watched people burn villages and call it liberation. I watched nations collapse under the weight of decisions made in rooms like this one, by people who thought they were being strong. The crowd shifted, minds turning. I understand danger, he continued. But I also understand the danger of what happens when we use that word to silence, to strike, to suppress. We dress fear in policy. We call it protection. Kristi folded her arms. You call it leadership. I call it avoidance. Avoidance of listening. Of learning. Of asking if maybe the beast wasn't the problem, but the mirror it held up. He turned to the audience one more time. You cannot lead what you fear. And you cannot fear what you take the time to understand. The audience was no longer divided. They were leaning forward. And Kristi? She wasn't out of arguments. She was out of ground to stand on. Kristi Noem took a deep breath and spoke again, this time slower, trying to reclaim ground with sincerity rather than fire. Look, she said, I didn't come here to be the villain. I did what I believed was right. I've made mistakes, sure, but I've also led, built, and protected my state. I don't pretend to be perfect. But I won't apologize for being strong. It was her softest moment of the night. And still, Traoré didn't attack. He didn't ridicule. He simply nodded, and responded like a man who understood the weight of power far too well. No one's asking you to apologize for being strong, he said gently. We're asking you to redefine what strength really means. He stepped to the front of the stage now, not towering, but standing with the quiet posture of earned authority. Strength isn't silence after harm. It's the courage to name what harmed us. It's not just protecting your own, it's asking why others had to suffer to make that protection possible. He looked to Kristi. "You're not the villain," he said. "You're the mirror. The reflection of a system that rewards force over listening, instinct over inquiry." And then, to the audience. "We've been told that leadership is about command. But maybe it's about presence. Maybe it's not about taming what we fear, but healing what we've broken." He raised his hand, not as a gesture of power, but of peace. True strength isn't walking alone and being proud of it. It's walking slowly, so others can keep up. Kristi looked away, lips pressed. She wasn't angry now. She was still. Because for the first time, she wasn't being debated. She was being seen. And Traoré? He hadn't just won the room. He had changed its definition of leadership. As the moderator stepped toward the center of the stage, clearly ready to end the panel, the audience sat still, almost unwilling to breathe, afraid to disturb the gravity of what had just unfolded. Kristi Noem stood in place. Not defeated. Not humiliated. But undeniably shifted. She had come to speak. Traoré had come to reveal. And the difference was everything. The moderator cleared his throat, but Traoré raised a hand gently, not to interrupt, but to finish. "One last word," he said. "Not to her. To all of you." He turned to face the crowd. "We don't lead by taming what we fear. We lead by understanding why we feared it to begin with." He glanced at Kristi, not with contempt, but with truth. "I don't question your strength," he said. "I question the story that taught you strength means silencing others." Then back to the crowd. "You were told the world is wild. That people are beasts. That only the strong deserve to decide. But leadership isn't about taming. It's about transforming." He paused, no performance, no showmanship. "Where I come from, the loudest voice isn't always the wisest. The person with the gun isn't always the protector. And the one who leads? Often does so by listening first. Then, quietly. If that makes me uncivilized, then perhaps it's time civilization listened harder." The room erupted, not in a roar, but in a powerful, rolling silence, followed by a slow, growing applause. Not for dominance, but for depth. Kristi didn't speak. She didn't need to. The contrast had already said it all. And Traoré? He didn't tame the room. He freed it. She came to show strength. He came to show what it means. Kristi Noem didn't lose a debate. She lost the illusion that leadership is about volume. She tried to define power as domination. He redefined it as responsibility. While she spoke of control, he spoke of connection. While she defended her actions, he defended the dignity of those who can't speak for themselves. This wasn't just a clash of politics. It was a collision of definitions. And in that room, with no yelling, no rage, Traoré didn't raise his voice, he raised the standard. So when she said, "We tame beasts," he didn't shout. He simply asked, "You call that leadership?" And the silence that followed answered for her.